and welcome back to the video, and today we're looking at a scenario where all Turkic countries united. So here we have Turkey, Azerbaijan, Northern Iran, Dagestan, multiple other territories of Russia, Central Asia, Xinjiang, and parts of Mongolia uniting under the new Turkic Federation. Obviously this couldn't happen in real life, but what if it did in the modern day? Of course, here we're starting off with the Russia-Ukrainian conflict, where Ukraine is making a counteroffensive. If you're wondering why I'm mapping this out in this video, unlike all the other ones where I don't, it is far more relevant here, as very early on it is going to have something big to do with this new country. Ukraine makes a massive counteroffensive, but soon enough, Russia manages to reconsolidate control of the entire Ukrainian east. In the south, Russia decides to retreat, as without Crimea, their units there are far worse off, and it is much harder to hold on to. Instead, Russia begins an offensive more towards the north and more in their centralized regions. This goes incredibly well, as they even start a reinvasion of the south, capturing much of eastern Ukraine. With this new Russian counteroffensive doing much better, especially once Belarus joined and started their own invasion of Ukraine, we see Russia getting a little cocky, and they demand that this new Turkic nation gives back all Russian territories that were taken. These territories include all of these, basically all Russian lands. Here in the south, they would be forced to return the lands north and east of Georgia, somewhere around there. They would also be forced to give back both of these territories that are encircled by the Russians, which is why they're so confident that they will get them back, and also be forced to give up parts of Kazakhstan to give Russia access to whatever the sea is called, as I forgot. Of course, this new Turkic Federation, being confident in their ability and also wanting to screw over Russia, denies it, and Russia, who most people assumed were completely bluffing, actually decides to go through with it and declares war on this new Turkic Confederation. Soon enough, they manage to push fully into the Caucasus Mountain region, pushing all the way down to the Azerbaijani border. They also managed to capture this pocket in central Russia and push back the Siberian forces from the west, although that is a much slower campaign. They then begin an invasion of Kazakhstan, and if you're wondering how they're doing so well, it is simply because this new nation has not had nearly enough time to prepare, not nearly enough time to consolidate their strength, and overall this is just many militaries not working very well together. Soon enough, most of Kazakhstan falls, along with parts of Uzbekistan, and Russia once again tells them, hey, sign a new peace, but this time we get parts of Kazakhstan, northern Azerbaijan, and all of Tuva. Of course, they decline this, and that is because Ukraine, who now has far less Russian units on their border, is starting to push back. And in Crimea, Ukraine and the Turkic Confederation come to an agreement. They work together to capture these lands, and they agree that by the end of the war, Crimea will be returned to Ukraine. As well, let's just say that this Turkic nation really, really needs Ukraine's help right now. Russia should also gain even more sanctions, as they are starting a completely unjust invasion of multiple nations, and as they're going through, they are plundering everything, trying to force these people to give up, trying to force them to give up their lands, and they just don't want to do that. The Turkic Confederation gives back the Crimean lands that they had taken to Ukraine, and Ukraine manages to push back in the south thanks to this. We also see the Turkic Confederation make progress in recapturing Azerbaijani territories and southern Russian territories, as this is where a lot of their fighting strength is at. They then push the Russians back in Central Asia, as the Russians are now far overextended and are struggling to hold on to their gains. Russia, who is now desperate for peace with the Turkic Confederation, offers them a new peace treaty in which they barely gain any lands in southern Russia, but they will be gaining eastern Kazakhstan and both pockets. The Turkic Confederation once again refuses this Russian request and continues to push the Russians back. In southern Russia, most territories are recaptured, along with a part of this pocket that Russia had captured near the beginning of the war, and some progress being made into Russia proper. At this point, even Ukraine is scoring victory after victory, pushing back the Russians, especially in the north. The Russians once again attempt to do what they did last time, give up the north and focus on the east to recapture as much as they can, but with a far overextended line, they do far worse. This is what the borders are now looking like, but not for very long. The Russians managed to capture this, basically just this piece of the Turkic Confederation that is not connected, but since it's literally just a bunch of tundra, nobody cares much. In Kazakhstan, the Turks are pushing the Russians back, and soon enough, the Russians have lost almost all of their progress. The Russians are now desperate. They tell the Turks to sign a peace treaty in which they only lose their territories that are currently encircled and captured by the Russians, and once again, the Turks deny this request and continue their invasion into southern Russia, capturing the Russian access to the Caspian Sea and reaching the Black Sea as well, meeting up with Crimea. From here, Ukraine will start its own counteroffensive in the east, along with in the north, where they pushed the Russians and Belarusians back nearly entirely to the border. This is looking very bad, but it's about to look even worse, as all of Kazakhstan is recaptured, and Russia is forced to practically give up on the entire Central Asian region. The Turks even managed to start to reconnect some of their, divided lands, whatever you want to call it. I don't think this region has a specific name, and if it does, then I don't know it. With this, Russia, who has not yet learned that these people do not want to negotiate, offers a peace treaty, which looks something like this. The Russians gain no lands except for a puppet in eastern Ukraine and this region right here, whilst a division of this region will happen. Guess what the Turks do? And the Ukrainians. They deny it. And soon enough, the Ukrainians and the Turks together manage to cut off the Russian sea access by capturing any important territories that Russia has left in the region. From here, the Turks honor their agreement with Ukraine and hand over Crimea along with surrounding areas to the country. Ukraine also begins an invasion of Belarus, as this isn't actually very much Ukrainian forces, it is a Belarusian revolution, in which the people of Belarus decide to rise up against their ruling party until eventually Belarus is forced into uniting with Russia. With this, Russia, although thinking that they just gained a bunch of land, is actually much worse off, as they now have protesters in their country and everyone is hating them even more. Funding for Ukraine hits an all-time high, and they manage to capture all of Belarus. They also push the Russians out of their country in the entirety. And for the first time since 2014, Ukraine is full again, with progress being done into the Russian country. Now, the Turks, who were much less focused on recapturing their own territory, managed to capture much of southern Russia and recapture all mainland territories that they lost, along with this, Russian-occupied region that the Russians had gotten near the start of the war. They then pushed the Russians back around Central Asia, where the Russians have no supply and everyone would rather be a part of this new Turkic Confederation than the Russian one. And now it is the Turks who offer the Russians a deal which the Russians are forced to accept, as their country is fracturing and they're petrified that they will fall into full chaos. In this, Belarus regains their independence as not a Ukrainian puppet, but a Ukrainian influenced state. Ukraine will regain all lands, along with a small region here around the Black Sea, which they will gain from this war. They will also gain a slight amount of northern land to ensure a small buffer between Russia and Kiev. As for the Turks, they will be allowed to connect all of their territories and the entire Caspian Sea and take over the entire Caspian Sea, including this former exclave that they had in Russia. They will be allowed a expansion into Central Asian territories, capturing just about everything they could have possibly hoped for, aka the entire thing. This is horrible for Russia, but there is nothing they can really do. Turkey and Ukraine hand back all territories that were not promised to the Russians in the peace treaty. And Russia is more than embarrassed. They have just lost an insane amount of land to the Turks, who have now set themselves up as the successors to the Russians as the third most powerful country in the world, rivaling India. Although, actually, that's probably wrong. Although they did just defeat the Russians and capture many lands, this was more of a defensive war and they had Ukrainian help. Along with much Western aid, they would most likely be behind India, possibly Japan as well, in the 5th or 6th spot, still ahead of the UK due to their immense size and a decent population, along with a large military, and of course Russian reparations. With that, their new goal is to secure themselves as the rulers of Central Asia. And who wants to end that? Well, of course, that is China. China also lost multiple lands to this new country popping up, and now it has expanded along their border and is beginning to threaten the Chinese by supporting insurgents in Tibet. Of course, China can't prove this, but everyone in the world, even those who support this new Turkic nation, know that they are the ones supporting the Tibetan rebels, along with other Turks who were a bit further into China and do not hold the majority in the region, which is why they did not get it. And, of course, there's the Russians, who want to get revenge on the Turks and on the Ukrainians and are more than willing to ally themselves with the Chinese to do it. Although, I don't even know if they'd go for revenge on the Ukrainians, as Ukraine barely took any lands, whilst this Turkic confederation took all of central Russia. Despite it being historically more Turkic than Russian in the modern day, it has grown very much so in Russian population, causing some unrest in the region, until eventually, of course, this Turkic nation, who has very close relations to NATO and decently close relations to the EU, and since, well, they didn't really hurt them at all, and they have the exact same enemies, Russia and China, their industry will begin to grow, and their people's lives will get better, whilst under Russia it was getting worse. With that, they will probably settle down within a few years, giving up on attempting to rebel and create their own Central Asian state, as, well, first of all, they would lose, and second of all, they don't really want to. As I already mentioned, their lives are now getting much better. What would the Turkic Confederation do for now, which I'm just going to call Turkey? I really don't have to say Turkic Confederation every single time I mention them. Well, as I already said, they're supporting rebels in Tibet and in central China. Along with Manchus, they're supporting anyone who doesn't want to be a part of this Han-dominated China. They're also making an alliance with India, with the promise of India getting all of Kashmir, whilst the Turks get all Turkic and many Mongolian territories, if a war ever does break out. From there, they will basically destroy Armenia. Russia isn't going to protect them, and Georgia, who is much more willing to cooperate, eventually joins this new confederation. They're not the most expansionist, but they definitely don't want to be separated either. From here, Russia experiences something not very beneficial. Over here in the east, without a land connection, and with this sea connection being very, very messed up, they are going to be declaring their independence from the Russian state. Japan is going to seize Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, And China is going to seize a puppet government in the nation, especially here in the south, where there will now be multiple Eastern Russian confederations. The Chinese dominated one on the Chinese border, and the Turkish slash American dominated one, which is more of an independent one, influenced by the Turkish and supported by the Americans, more in the north. Of course, Russia is going to be pissed about this, but once again, they can't do anything and they eventually give up on it and try to improve their own nation, hoping that eventually the opportunity will come where they can reclaim their lost lands. Ukraine also doesn't want to get too close to the Turkic Confederation. They were seen as necessary allies, but they aren't exactly the closest. This Turkic Confederation is now also, I believe, the largest country, surpassing Canada, and of course Russia, who has now been divided. And what do they even want from here? Well, they want to secure influence in the Middle East. They can't really do anything in Asia, as Russia and China are still very much the worthy opponents, and Russia, who now has quelled most rebellions and is much more of a stable nation, although they're still struggling. They've given up on most non-Rus or underpopulated territories, which means they will now be fighting a defensive war and most likely win, without Ukrainian aid on the Turkish side. Aside from that, there's China, who has increased their influence into the entirety of Eastern Asia. They are now, well, you're either allied with the West or with China. And China, of course, invites Russia, who joins very much so willingly. So yeah, there's no way that this Turkish Confederation would be able to take on this new Chinese alliance. They wouldn't even be able to take on China on their own. Where are they going to go? As I already mentioned, to the Middle East, where they're going to interfere with in Syria. As the civil war almost ends, new pro-Turkish insurgents rise up in the north, and over here in Iraq in the Kurdistan region. These insurgents are pro-Turkish and anti-Syrian and Iraqi. And of course, despite Turkey saying that they aren't supporting them, in reality everyone knows that they are. Soon enough, all of northern Syria is captured, along with all of northern Iraq, and some form of peace is drawn up. In this, we also see them capturing a small amount of Iran, although there's nothing Iran can really do about it, as, well, there's no way they could beat this major nation that's right on their doorstep. From here, the peace will be drawn up, in which all of northern Syria, including the coastline, and much of Iraq and Iran will be taken by the Turks, mainly Kurdish regions, as they have been promoting pro-Kurdishism inside of their own nation, giving them much autonomy. With this, the Syrian civil war is over, and Iraq and Iran are just pissed off. Iran wasn't even involved in the war and were actually trying to get themselves straightened out next to this major power, and now they've lost a lot of land, and they're incredibly mad. They'll most likely try to stage something to get some amount of revenge, but they will most probably fail. As I don't know how many times I have to mention this, but this Turkish nation is far more powerful. How would World War III play out? The biggest question here, with this mega superpower in Central Asia, what side would they be on? I do not see them being fully Western aligned. This is not some US aligned government that just took over all of Central Asia. This is a anti-Russian and Chinese country that just so happens to have similar goals as the Americans. So although they will most likely be on the same side of the war as NATO and Arabia, parts of South America and Africa get involved on the American side, with parts of Africa, China, Russia, Pakistan, and Southeast Asia joining on the Chinese side, along with India most likely being on the Turkish side, as they are becoming surprisingly good allies with very common enemies, in India, who is choosing to get closer to the Turks and further away from the Russians as time goes on. With that, I'm going to end it here, as I do not want to map out an entire World War III with this mega nation. They have accomplished most of their goals, consolidating Central Asia, putting Iran in their place, and expanding themselves to a very respectable state as the largest country on the planet. With that, I do hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.